Okay, I'm going to do a quick video about the burrito controversy and how it's just a distraction. Housing is a real problem. This week, the American political discourse machine ground to a halt over a burrito. It started small. A spokesman for Turning Point USA posted a story about a college student who told him, in so many words, that burritos shouldn't cost $20. It was meant as a quick, relatable anecdote about inflation. Instead, it set up a full-blown civil war on the right. On one side, populists arguing that the affordability crisis is real, that young people are hurting, and that the party ignores this at its own peril. On the other side, an older guard of fiscal conservatives, commentators, a sitting congressman, and even the vice president got involved at one point, telling people to stop whining, get a job, and eat ramen like everyone else did in college. It got ugly. It got personal. It became, by some accounts, a genuine referendum on whether the Republican Party even believes affordability is a real problem or just a talking point for people who don't want to work. And look, on the literal facts, it's not a $20 crowd has a point. A burrito from a fast casual chain runs you $9, $10, maybe $12. You only really hit $20 once you add delivery fees, a service charge, a tip, and guacamole. That's not inflation, that's convenience pricing. But that's also not the point. And the fact that an entire wing of the political commentariat spent a week arguing about delivery fees instead of what's actually eating people alive tells you everything about how disconnected this conversation is from the actual problem. Because the burrito was never the story. It was a stand-in. And the real story is about who still gets to own something in this country. Here's what's revealing about the just get a job response. It's not that it's cruel, it's that it's outdated. When a Dan Crenshaw type says, I lived on ramen with 4 roommates and I didn't complain, he's not lying about his own experience. He's describing a real common American story, temporary scarcity on the way up to something better. You eat cheap in your 20s because you're investing in a career, in savings, eventually in a down payment. The suffering has a purpose. It's a bridge to somewhere. That's the implicit deal embedded in stop whining and get a job. Work hard for now, the hallway leads somewhere. That's not a controversial value, it's the value. The problem is the hallway increasingly doesn't lead anywhere. Not because young people today are lazy or worse of money or addicted to delivery apps in a way previous generations weren't. It's because the thing that used to be waiting at the end of the hallway, a started home, a foothold, an appreciating asset you could build a life around, is no longer reliably there. But when it is there, it's priced for someone with a lot more capital than the first-time buyer typically has. So when a 22-year-old complains about a $20 burrito, what they're actually reacting to isn't the burrito. It's the accumulated compounding sense that the math doesn't work anymore. That scarcity now might not be temporary. That generational rupture is what affordability even means. And it's the rupture that the burrito discourse is standing in for. To see the actual $20 burrito, don't look at a delivery app, look at the housing market. For most of the last century, the single-family home has been the primary on-ramp to American class wealth. Not because homes are magically great investments on their own merits, but because home equity was a forced savings vehicle that let an ordinary family over a couple of decades turn a mortgage payment into a net worth engine. You didn't need to be a sophisticated investor, you just need to buy a home and hold it. That on-ramp is being narrowed from both ends. Prices have outpaced wage growth for years, and increasingly, the buyer on the other side of a listing isn't a young family, it's an institutional investor. Private equity and large-scale landlords have moved specifically into starter homes tier, the exact segment of the market a first-time buyer will be competing in. That's not a coincidence, that's what the yield is. Because that's what the renters are. The same young people can buy are the ones institutional buyers are counting on to rent instead. This is the part Just Work and Save doesn't account for. It assumes the ladder is still there, just that you need to climb faster. But when a structural share of a ladder is being bought out by capital that has no intention of ever selling it back to an individual owner, working harder doesn't close the gap. You're not behind on a race, you're competing for a resource against a buyer who doesn't need to win, just needs to hold. That's the real $20 burrito. It's not a convenience charge, it's the door quietly closing. I've made the case before that multi-generational households are where this is headed. And I want people precise about why. Because it's easy to hear that as a consolation prize. Well, you can't own a home, so move back in with your parents. That's not the argument. The argument is that concentrating on a family's liquidity into one illiquid, single-owner asset was always a fragile strategy. And it is an essentially fragile one in a market where the asset class is being competed for by institutional capital. Multi-generational housing isn't a downgrade from that strategy. It's an adaptation to conditions the old strategy no longer reliably works. Done well, it's not a sacrifice, it's a trade. Shared housing costs across the family instead of concentrating in a single mortgage, built-in elder care instead of outsourcing nursing facilities, and a home that stays inside the family instead of being sold off and reabsorbed into the market at the end of life. It requires being on decent terms with your parents. That's a real caveat and not a small one. But for families where that's the truth, it's a genuinely rational response to a housing market that stopped rewarding the old playbook. The people mocking 20-year-olds for wanting affordable food are, most of them, homeowners who buy in under completely different conditions. The multi-generational model isn't young people giving up on home ownership. It's young people redesigning ownership around a market that no longer works the way it did for the parents. Here's what the burrito fight exposed. An entire wing of American politics doesn't have an answer for the affordability question. And instead of admitting that, they argue about condiments. The party split into two camps. One insisting the crisis is real and needs an economic answer. One insisted the crisis is a personal failing, and neither side notably spent much time talking about the actual asset class where the crisis lives. That's not an accident. Housing is a much harder problem to wave away with a story about ramen noodles. So no, the burrito was never $20, but the door at the end of the hallway increasingly is. And until that's the conversation, the discourse is just going to keep finding new foods to argue about.